I gotta give myself more time for that intro. 30 seconds is not enough to make sure this is live on every channel, but I think we're doing pretty well right now. I got a dais of winners in front of me right now. I might have done myself a disservice by picking such a highfalutin name for this, the Christian-Pagan Synthesis Summit. What we're going to do is we're just going to have a good time. I think we're going to have a great Tuesday night. I got a lot of guys up here. A few of them will be familiar to those who listen to Blood Satellite. My good friend Christopher Sandbatch, my good friend Fortissax, and new to the show, NorthHugr?
Yeah, you get it right. Yeah.
Excellent. And I'm just going to throw up a few links there. So for NorthHugr, you had recently released a documentary, which we're going to throw up on the screen in a second. But if anyone wants to follow the link, his YouTube is right there at the bottom. Let's not forget Chris Sandbatch at ecoamericana.substack.com, a phenomenal Substack. I would say Mr. Sandbatch is one of the last men of letters in America, single-handedly getting me back into writing poetry. I'm seeing him do such a good job at it. He's given me the infection of creativity.
The way you know how that all started?
Of the poetry?
Yeah, that's a relatively new. I mean, I've been doing it for really my whole adult life, but actually showing it to people, I was like, my car busted in a Buc-ee's, and and I sat there for 3 hours. Why? There's this bird in Texas. It's like, oh well, you all might have it. We don't really have it in the deep southeast. It's a corvid. It's called a grackle, and they don't have them in Louisiana where I'm from. And I was
I love crackers.
sitting there in the parking lot looking at this grackle, and I wrote a poem about it, and I shared it, and people didn't unfollow me, so I kept doing it over and over and over again. And now, unfortunately, I've gotten pretty good at it.
I swear, the fulcrum of this entire scene is Buc-ee's. Everything
Yes.
comes back to this fucking place. My buddy Thomas 777 went there for the first time. He talked about it like it was a religious pilgrimage. I could only be disappointed by going to Buc-ee's at this point. Lastly, but not leastly, we got my good friend Fortissax here. You got to check out fortissax.substack.com. It's one of the most beloved Substacks out there. This guy, he just accidentally creates gems. I'm fine with that. I'm fine seeing someone effortlessly create these great things. So we'll shout all that out at the end. What I'm going to do is just in the background here, I'm just play. It's going to be muted, but we can just get some visuals here. This was we have the documentary created by NorthHugr. Have some visuals here. Look how well produced that is. By the way, first of all, there's not a lot of great produced content here. This should be at 100,000 views. This should be at 500,000 views. The fact that it's not is a damning indictment of everyone in the space. Look how beautiful this is. You could have this on Netflix. So everyone go check that out. What you had done, and this is why I really wanted to have you on to speak on this topic that we've visited on our show quite a bit, and I discuss it all the time. In fact, many of us discuss it. You were trying to approach paganism from a Christian perspective. I know that's a very loose description of what you were trying to achieve here, but I was wondering if you could just give us a brief synopsis of this this wonderful piece you had created.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's pretty high praise. The one of the benefits of putting things on YouTube is you can, at the end of the day, if you get critiqued for it as a documentary, you can fall back on the Mott and Bailey and just say, no, it's this is just a YouTube video, guys. Don't worry, don't hold it so high. But it was a really fun experience. What it is essentially at its core, it's mixing and matching a few elements structurally, like it's part video essay, part long form podcast, but also very much leans into the documentary style of filmmaking, leans into the sort of visual language and audio language of a documentary. And the structure of it really is this sort of dialectic between contemporary Christianity and paganism. I guess by contemporary Christianity, it'd be my own outlook on Christianity as someone who's grown up in a more sort of Lutheran sphere and interacting with Tom Rousseau, who's perhaps the prominent influencer in the Germanic heathenry space as a historian, as an influencer, as a like a filmmaker in his own right. So it was a great way for us to kind of have this conversation. I brought along a friend, Michael Portos, who brought in his own expertise as a theologian as well. So hopefully we didn't gang up too much on him, although maybe a little bit. But I wanted to kind of present his worldview, my own worldview, and just see how these interplay. So the structure is very much back and forth. And yeah, Tom was amazing to work with. We get up to some cool adventures on the trip, and Tom has his own journey in the documentary, his own goal to visit this holy mountain called Helgafell, which is dedicated to the Norse god Thor. And it's all kind of leading up to that at the end.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful documentary. And as we had said, you approach that the paganism from a Christian perspective. And my good friend Fortissax, I described him as the inverse. He is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Forty, not pagan, but a Hellenist. Would that be a fair assessment?
I would say that, yes. I would say my religious proclivities are Hellenism, specifically Julian Hellenism, if you want to get super autistic.
I got the Hellenist Museum pulled up here, just to give the folks at home an idea of what the heck that is. Is that a good source? Should I have something else up there?
No, I mean, I haven't personally checked it out myself, but it's probably not too bad. I think Hellenism's pretty straightforward.
Because if I want to go to Lego, I go to the Lego Museum. They would know.
That's right. I mean, I tend to prefer just HellenicFaith.com. I find that's a very good repository for a lot of the ancient stuff. A lot of stuff on the theology, the cosmology, and things like their chain of being and so forth. Yeah, that one. It's great. It's a great sort of repository for the general worldview.
And Mr. Sandbatch, I call him Sandy. We're adorable like that, but I can call you Sandbatch for the Sandman.
It's been so long now. You can call me anything you want.
I just don't call me late for dinner.
Yeah.
Now we were trying to describe where you sit spiritually and religiously.
Right now I am a practicing Catholic right now, but there's a really interesting story behind that, which is that the Edward Habsburg, the character that floats around Twitter.
Yeah.
I was like subtweeting him one day, and I said, blank, if blankety blank happens, then I'll convert to Catholicism. And then it happened, and he responded to me and said, you have to convert now. And I was like, well, that's like, that's awfully fucking medieval. I think I just got forcibly converted to paganism.
Hey, there's been worse conversion stories than losing a bed.
Right, but it's directly to the House of Habsburg. It's one of those things. But it doesn't really change. It doesn't. I'm in this sort of religious space that you could really put any word on it you want to. The operative word for me religiously is American, and so that's
how I described you, because I would say he is truly of the American identity and purely of the American context. I don't think that could be divorced from Protestantism. I don't think.
Yeah, no. So here's a way that I'm able to sort of excuse my Catholicism at this point, whereas I can make an argument that first it hinges on this idea of Protestantism. Protestantism is to protest, okay, right? You're protesting something, okay? If you get the most powerful country in the world, and you get them to all start it's a generally Protestant country, you get them to start protesting, you get them to start getting involved, converting to Catholicism and get them involved, you've actually somehow managed to turn American Catholicism into the bodily weapon that Protestantism is hurling at the gates of Rome itself. Whereas what we're going to do is we're going to all convert to Catholicism, but we're going to take our preconceived Protestant attitudes with us, and we're actually going to turn the Church of Rome Protestant by just sheer money and numbers. And I think that's what's happening right now. So right now, I think the most Protestant thing you can do is convert to Catholicism.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, actually, that you apprehend this idea from a Protestant context that you cannot really remove yourself from as a
See,
Westerner in a sense.
yeah, I mean, my family's been Anglican forever, but I was educated by Jesuits, so I'm like all fucked up. Shit's all fucked up, and I look retarded religiously. But at the base of it, I have an issue. My issue with Protestantism is Protestantism has this root to protest. You are protesting something. But what do you do? And Protestantism is very effective. And we'll probably get into this a little bit. It's very effective, especially in the first century of its existence. But when you look at, especially things like post-Vatican II reforms, this sort of thing, oh, what have they done? Post-Vatican II Catholic Mass is really, it's the Merbecki Mass. It's the Anglican Mass that's been put through Google Translate. They ended simony. They ended all these. They systemically ended a number of these practices that were Luther's original complaints. So you have to sort of like Protestantism has this very temporal attribute attached to it, is that we're protesting. We have sundered ourselves from the church, and we've gone off into the wilderness to bear the burden of our own sins. If the conditions of your protest have started to lessen, then you start running out of reasons to be in protest. If you know what I mean? So like
Yeah, that's a phenomenal argument. And actually, if there's one common ground, I think that would unite all of us, because I haven't even said what the fuck it is I am. So I'm a Catholic, but I was speaking with a buddy of mine. I think it was probably Kruptos. I was on a show recently, and he's big into Jacques Ellul. And we're talking about how Jacques Ellul's description of the technicalization of modernity, making it so people can only apprehend the spiritual from a rational way, or breaking it down and dissecting it. And we'll get into this a bit later when we discuss
what do you mean when you say modernity?
Well, that's a good point. You caught me, because I don't even like using that word. I was going to say the Western liberal context that no one can really step outside of, in the sense that that's defined by people constantly trying to step outside of themselves and draw a line out of whatever it is that they are. It's like living in a meta sense. So you can never really immerse yourself in spirituality, which is the point I was making, that it seems that many Christians, it's hard for me to say this and a lot of people take offense, but I would say that even some of those devout Christians, if they're living in the Western world, tend to apprehend these ideas in a very rationalist way, some of them in a very political way. And the same thing with a lot of paganism. And this isn't just me striking across the aisle to pagans. I think we all kind of do.
No, I would
this.
agree. Yeah.
And so they're approaching paganism from a rational or scientific or even political, cultural sense. But do we really believe these things, or is it something else?
All right. So I love all of that. I want to put a pen in a couple of things you did there. So you refer to this Western liberal rational modernity, right? One of the things that is the real crux of like what's very close to the root of whatever Sandbatchism is that this thing that you're referring to as the Western liberal rational whatever, it is fundamentally Protestant at its base, and it is in fact one modernity in a number of modernities that arose around the same time between the 16th and 17th century in Europe. So that is a modernity that you've seen me refer to it as the circle peoples. I have lots of different euphemisms to get around what I'm really saying.
Yeah. For the folks at home, the circle people is you draw a circle on the map that encompasses, I believe it's England, the bottom part of Scandinavia. Am I getting that right?
The Low Countries, England, Denmark. I draw it a little bit different every time. But when you're talking about modernity, you're referring to the emergence of these really all-encompassing, idealized civilizational structures that start growing out of really what is the end of the tail end of the collapse of the medieval world, which is this defined by and large by this sort of tension between the papacy and secular kingships. Okay, and where the secular kings start to win out, you get the emergence of these two modernities. So, you get an Italian modernity, an Italian Catholic modernity. This is the birth of double entry bookkeeping, the flowering of the Italian city-states, so on and so forth. But then on the other hand, the second Renaissance that occurs is in the Low Countries, and it has very distinctive elements that are actually, we make the case, we would probably eventually make the case, they re-import quite a bit of their original paganism and create a modernity that is totally different and competitive with the sort of Catholic modernity. That's how you can kind of look at Protestantism and Catholicism moving into the 18th and 19th centuries. And then in the 20th century, you get what is like, it's just nearly total Northern Europe because of the Anglo-American project, everything like that. You get this total hegemonic stature of the rational, liberal, Western modernity that kind of clogs up and covers up whatever. When you're looking at like what is the last gasp of Catholic modernity, you start looking at people like Gabriele D'Annunzio and Italian fascism and that sort of thing, and it's crushed at the end of World War II. And we only have this other modernity from there on out. So that's this, like, stick a pen in those things. Those are like little nomenclatures that I'm going to probably use again.
No, that's an interesting take. And like when you look at Western Europe, despite the lingering differences in the Latin world, you know, in France and in Italy and Spain, they're still more closely aligned in the worldview, even culturally, as a direct consequence of the exported Anglo-American culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you touch on something there, both of you, and maybe we can launch into this right now. One of the central topics I wanted to discuss was a somewhat controversial book that I had read. I know we originally had my good friend Tyler Hamilton scheduled to be on this, and he, despite being a Catholic, does not like this book at all. He's busy over in Rome. His plans to become the current pope were obviously thwarted, so I assume he's going to be the next pope. But he's here in spirit as we discuss the book, The Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity. We covered that on the show. I know a few people have read it. Some people like it. Some people, I remember saying you had said you like the spirit of it, even though there's factual inaccuracies in it. And NorthHugr, this is something that I think was what you're kind of getting to in the documentary. Or at least, yeah.
I mean, I haven't read the book yet, so I can't comment necessarily on the specifics of the book, but yeah, certainly some of the topics I'm certain overlap.
Yeah, so just to give a brief analysis for people, and maybe I butcher in the telling, and I'd love to hear where the book goes wrong. We don't need to just accept the conclusion of the book, but the story was early medieval Christianity, as it was expanding, and had many failed attempts at expanding, as it's failed in Japan, failed in India, failed with the Jews famously, but it worked in several other countries, with one of the most notable ones being the Germanic people. And the idea was that something like a synthesis had occurred where, you know, to appeal to the Germanic peoples, who were a very different type of people than the Christians, who might have been more urban focused. These were very rural people, very tribal people. They had a completely different kin network, and they had their own heroes, their own values. And so to make Christianity appeal to them, they had to reframe Christianity as something that they would like. And in doing so, as it was slowly adopted by the Germanic people, their values and their principles fed back into the church as a sort of feedback loop. So a couple of examples of that would be prioritizing the image of Jesus as a heroic figure, as vanquishing the devil, very, very heroic in his outlook. And that's just one of the many examples. But I just wanted to know, what do people think of that premise? Do we think that happened? Or in some cases, those who have read it, where do you think the book might get wrong?
Okay, look. What do you think the process is? Because this is one of those things that's been mythologized to hell. What do you think the process is? And they do it different ways, so this is a huge question. What's the process by which you go about? So Christianity, you know, you're thinking like the game Halo, like where the flood gets unleashed. How does Christianity go from being this small heretical Hebraic cult of, a few hundred people in Palestine to being this world-encompassing religion? And it's interesting you pointed out failures, because Christianity initially explodes to the east harshly. It's initially sort of stymied in the West by the existence of like sort of new, like a kind of emergent. It's not quite the Homeric paganism, but there's still an institutionalized paganism. So Christianity's initial growth is, explosively eastward. But like, let's take an example that's more familiar to us. How do they go about Christianizing Britain? What is the actual process there? It involves a lot of things that, traditional, like contemporary Catholic mythology and Protestant theology and Protestant mythology don't think really happened. For like one, we have this idea that the Gospels were in Latin, and that texts and vernacular traditions were sort of closely guarded. That's not fucking true at all. In fact, the way the church, this is like just the church at this point because there's no schism. The way it goes about Christianizing Britain is it goes in with this one book. Okay, they had their forerunners into Anglo-Saxon England, and they show up with this one book, which is this combinatorial gospel. It's a combination of the four gospels that have been like rolled into one, and they learn the native language, and they translate this book into the native language so they can teach it to the locals. So that's right out of the gate, first thing they do. But interestingly, that's the only thing they translate. Okay, and if you look at the the synoptic gospels, especially, and you look at John, there's a lot of wisdom in them. There's a lot of stories in them, and there is a lot of politics in them. But there's not actually a lot. It's a very flexible spine. So it's this story that can really easily bend itself to like sort of local and native traditions. And we probably see this in the British peoples the best. The poem that is most associated with the Christianization of Britain is this poem called The Dream of the Rood, which is it's this poem about this dude who's drunk in a longhouse or like on the feasting hearth hall or something like that. And he wakes up in the middle of the night and he hallucinates that he's like that this tree is talking to him, and this tree tells him the story about how it's this, it was in this great war band with this warrior, with this warrior king who did this great thing and sacrifices himself for his people, and then this warrior becomes the tree on which this warrior king is crucified. And that's the story that's how Christianity is introduced into, really into Britain. I mean, it was probably other stuff, but Christianity comes in softly in Britain. It's very successful in Britain. It doesn't come in as softly in like northern Germany, and so it's not as successful there. But it comes in so softly in Britain that it allows the British peoples, and these are Germanic peoples, they're Anglo-Saxons at this point. It allows them to take these gospel stories and gives them an incredible amount of leeway with what they want to do with them. And they do exactly what this book says they do, which is they're like, okay, well, this is really just a new framework for how we can kind of govern use these old structures that we had. So like, we don't really understand all this Greek philosophy that you people have, but this basic story of Jesus makes sense to us, and with a few changes, it fits perfectly into our system. So I mean, the baseline thesis in this book is absolutely correct.
Yeah, and to build off of that as well, like I would say even looking at this from a purely temporal and anthropological perspective, you can kind of see the sequence of events. Like if you look at the geopolitics of the 400s, you look at the fall of the West, the Papacy inherits this destroyed city of Rome. They lack the manpower and resources to properly and adequately proselytize in the way that they wanted to. And one of the core arguments that Russell makes in this book is the fundamental incompatibility prompted accommodation, but also the lack of manpower and resources. So they had no choice but to be at the whims of these agrarian sort of feudal lords, and they had to accommodate them in some respects in exchange for protection, while also just not having enough people to go north and proselytize to the Germanic tribes. And so while this was supposed to be temporary measures, what ended up happening was a synthesis. And I would point to Numa Coulange in The Ancient City, where he says that, the earliest religions are chthonic. They're almost, and then as new religions come, they sort of become folk religions. The folk aspects remain. They remain part of the folk and cultural practices, they sort of take the back bench, but they're still there. They're always there, and you can see this process unfold in Dark Age. I shouldn't say Dark Age, as there's some questions about whether or not it was, but you can see this process occurring in the 400s to the 1200s. You see Germanic burials with the feet pointed north, although they're Christian burials, and like these are pagan practices. You see lingering practices like concubineship among Frankish kings all throughout Charlemagne's time period. Their cultural habits, such as alcoholism, remain. There's a famous Moorish scholar complaining about how to encounter the Franks, and I don't remember his name, but basically he says, like, we can't fight the Franks in open field because they'll destroy us. So the way to beat them is to destroy their alcohol supplies, and then they'll just go home.
Yeah.
So like all of these, like early Christianity was very, very heavily Germanicized, and it goes from being an urban, very cosmopolitan religion associated with the early, with the lower classes, with slaves, with the dejected. Although in the East, as Sandbatch pointed out, it was in the elites, it was in the intellectual classes, but in the West, it wasn't the case. But then, as you see, as the Germanic tribes move in, their faith transforms from this urban, cosmopolitan, multicultural religion to a heroic religion with a lot of cultural hallmarks of the predecessors.
And what's interesting is that throughout the Christian expansion, at every level of society, from the plebs up to the aristocracy, people are asking the same question: what's in it for me? And there's a different answer to every one of those questions. I know in Charles Cochrane's book, Christianity and Classical Culture, which I'm going to be covering with my buddy Prudentialist soon. I already covered it on Blood Side, but we'll be doing like a two-parter on it. And Rodney Stark does this as well. But I like Cochrane's more because he shows like what appealed to these different strata of society because everyone knows that there was a capture of the elite minds. Okay, there's conversions of kings, yes, but there was so many more dimensions to how this thing spread. I think that's something Sandy was getting to.
Well. Dude, I mean, there's so much here. Even the use of that word king, okay? The use of that word king, you don't see that word. You don't see that word you really don't see that word in Latin inscriptions. You don't see that word in Latin inscriptions until you get these Gothic kings that have converted to Christianity. There's so much going on here. Because what is it? This king thing it's subject to a higher power. A king is always subject to a higher power. Imperator, Basileus, Pontifex, something like that. So whenever this Ostrogothic king comes in, we refer to him as the king of the Romans. All of a sudden, that's very different than the emperor of the Romans, because he's conceding that there is a higher power, that there's something that he's subject to, which is sort of interesting. But the very early history of Christianity, I have a hard. We may not want to mix that in too much. We may really want to pick up the person we probably want to pick up with. The person that this stuff starts to take on its modern recognizable structures was this figure of Leo the Great. Okay, and Fortissax just referred to the material constraints on Rome. There are a lot of interesting things that are happening here. One of the things is the Western Roman Empire has collapsed. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian has waged an incredibly destructive war attempting to retake Italy. So there is Christianity in the East. Christianity in the East is a totally different thing. It follows this, marches to the beat of its own drum. But in the West, you suddenly have this issue where, okay, we have all these nominally converted kingdoms everywhere, okay, but the ability, Pope Leo, again, Rome has gone from a city of 1 million people in the 3rd century to a city of about 56,000 in the 7th century. That's how bad the population collapse was at Rome. But it still is operating as this sort of nominal head of this. It is still operating as this sort of nominal head of this Christian church. It doesn't have any temporal power whatsoever. Italy is sort of finally totally ruined by these Justinian wars. This character Leo the Great, he's one of these figures that could be argued as the ultimus Romanorum, the last of the Romans. He's got a classical education. He grew up on the Palatine Hill, and his family's villa was within sight of the ruins of Pompey's amphitheater. Okay, so he grows up as a Roman aristocrat in this ruined city, looking at the grandeur that was Rome. And he sort of looks around him and realizes there's no one taking care of Italy, the Italian country. So he does something that hadn't ever really been done before. He starts to establish the church as a temporal power. He says the church is the only institution here that can actually restore order, keep the roads open, so on and so forth. So this is really the birth of Catholicism in a lot of ways. Is this idea that the church is not just going to be this abstract power that is backed up by Roman imperial authority. It's going to have to be its own thing. And so it's initially this concept that is the papacy, its ability to project its own power. And by its own power, I mean Roman orthodoxy, what Roman Catholicism looked like at the city of Rome. It is initially very limited. It is really initially limited for the first few hundred years to the Rome and the region of Lazio in Italy, and whoever the aristocrats of Rome were making good deals with. Beyond that, in the back country, in France, in Britain, in Galicia, in all of the places that have nominally converted to Christianity in the Western Empire, there is no method for data exchange. There's no method for data and material exchange. So like if the Pope decides, the Pope today writes an encyclical and he hits send and it goes to every Catholic in the world. Back then, if the Pope wanted to levy a tax, he had to go negotiate with different bishops in the different Italian city-states that are 20 miles away. He does not have the absolute authority. He has the nominal temporal spiritual authority, but his spiritual authority exists in tension with this sort of temporal authority that he has. And the temporal authority is important enough that he can't risk too much on the spiritual authority. So he has to let, for hundreds of years, more or less, he has to let Britain in particular, and France and Spain and all of these other places. He just has Ireland in particular. Ireland has this whole thing called, because they never repaganized. They have this whole thing called the Age of Legends, where there's essentially church rule in Ireland, entirely independent. They pay nominal dues to the Pope, but the Pope and the Roman Church, they don't really have anything to do with what's going on. And this is really what we call the Dark Age. And it was a real Dark Age in the sense of this, but this Dark Age kind of allows for all of these very strange regional Christianities to bloom and prosper. And the Germanic peoples tended to bend Christianity into their existing system, and they're a warrior people. They're a warrior, they're an honor. They do some things that Mediterranean Christianity doesn't. Okay, they despise lying. Okay, Mediterranean peoples, as we all know, some of our favorite East Mediterranean peoples don't have any problem with lying. Truth is not a necessarily highly valued, if you go back to what the Greek word aristo comes from an even older word that means truth teller. So the Greeks, what aristocrat actually means in its original context is that the Greeks only expected truth from a very small percentage of their population. That was it. They're the only ones that have to tell the truth. They're going to get a special position in society. Germans didn't think that way. They're very frank. They're very forthright. They're an honor culture, So personal honor matters to them. And we see the Christianity and the governing system around which they build this. It incorporates a lot of these very personal, person-to-person pagan elements, like the concept of a self, an individual self's integrity, gets woven directly into the way their Christianity functions as a government. And as the papacies, particularly in the texts from the 11th to the 13th century, as the papacy's ability to start projecting power outside of Italy, they start coming into contact with into conflict with these English kings, like Henry II is probably the most famous one. The ecclesiastical, what is the ecclesiastical court versus what is the king's law? These paganized Germanized Christianities that have grown up along the rim where the papacy where Mediterranean Christianity couldn't project any power, they start coming into conflict with one another. And this is one of the big feedback loops that creates the Protestant Reformation. I mean, this is a huge thing. This material, because when Christianity flips over and decides that it's going to be a temporal power and not just this floating abstract concept, then it becomes limited. The Pope's ability suddenly becomes limited to claim authority, and he has to slowly expand. But
there's another really good book on this too that I've been scouring and taking notes on, but it's actually called The Saxon Savior: The Germanic Transformation of the Gospel in the 9th Century Helliand, and this is by Father G. Ronald Murphy from the Society of Jesus, or SJ.
Socioreligious Jesu, better known as the Jesuits, by the way.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So what he does here is he breaks down the conversion of the Saxons, and he starts off the book in the first few pages. He talks about how they sent Boniface, who had failed to sufficiently convert the Celtic tribes in the island of Britain. He was very dissatisfied with the way they went about it. He personally thought that they were a little bit too accommodating.
Yes.
So he tried the reverse in continental Germany, and this culminated in the chopping down of the Irminsul, which is kind of an effigy of the World Tree.
Yes.
And this did not have the intended consequence. In our circles, this is often touted as a dunk by many of the Christians, but what actually happened here, as Father Murphy talks about, is the sparked the 33-year war between the Saxons and the Franks, and it led to an unnecessary death of thousands of Franks and Saxons on both sides, because it just caused resentment throughout the entire Germanic world, all the way up to Scandinavia. What you see with the Germanic tribes is they'd have this habit where they would lose in battle, and then they would convert to Christianity, and then they would turn their swords into plowshares, and then they'd go home, and then 2 years later they would revolt again. And they would just do this 10 or 12 times repeatedly forever, rejecting the authority of the Franks, rejecting the authority of the church. And what's ironic is that this very forceful method of chopping down the Irminsul is a very Germanic thing to do. It's a very, so like even the Franks, in their desire to convert their fellow Saxons, their fellow Germanic tribes, result to this very pagan sort of brute force, very tribal pagan brute force to try and convert their brethren. And it completely backfires until an unknown author in the 9th century, and to this day nobody knows who it was or who he was or where he worked, writes the Saxon Helliand, or the Saxon Gospel.
Yes.
And the Saxon Gospel reinterprets the story of the Gospel in terms and in references that the Germanic tribes can understand. So instead of Rome being a city, they refer to it as a hill fort. They call it Rümeberg. And they refer to Jesus as Droten. I'm probably mispronouncing that because I don't speak Old Continental Saxon.
No, you got
it. But they refer to Jesus as Droten, and Jesus is not just Jesus. He's also a tribal war chief. He's a king, and his 3 followers are spearmen. They're spearmen in his shield wall. And Judas is a fellow swordsman. And in this retelling, Jesus is effectively branded as this kind of warrior conqueror who personally slays death in combat. And for whatever reason, this worked. It completely worked, and the Saxons, within the next 50 years in the 9th century, almost unanimously converted to Christianity. And again, this was all meant to be temporary. It was meant to be a sort of temporary process of accommodation. But once again, due to resource constraints and manpower constraints, they did not have the capacity to go full. And this lingers on into the 10th and 12th centuries. 10th and 11th centuries. And mostly due to the influence of the Ottonian emperors, this sort of Germanized Christianity became normative throughout Western Europe.
Yes.
To the point where it was so integrated that its foreignness to original Christian doctrine was barely recognized. And what's fascinating is that the universalist claims of Christianity to the Germanics was muted. The soteriological nature of early Christianity was blunted. They did not have an innate desire for salvation, which is something that very few people recollect when it comes to the subject. And the appeal had to shift. It survived by spreading to become something closer to the Germanic religious ideal.
Look at the
sacred
Crusades.
kingship, Well, exactly, dude. The Crusades, the Crusades
Who?
are just the Crusades are Normans, right? Like,
Yeah, the concept of a crusade is so thoroughly Germanic, it's insane. Okay, the Crusades are initially called by a Norman pope. Okay, this is a Norman who is this is a, one of the this is a Norman pope that has called these Crusades. This is in specific. God, Christianity is so malleable. It's so able to work itself into whatever tradition. But these people, they have this tradition where you require honor to be able to enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to have done something worth doing. So you have to go conquer. You have to go conquer land for your warrior Jesus King, and that's what the
that's right.
Crusades are. You know.
It's the Normans in particular are fascinating because aside from the religion officially being Christianity, there's nothing really Christian about them. One of the most famous paintings, of the Normans is Norman pirates in the 7th century, and it's a painting of two Normans bride napping a woman after a village raid, bringing them back to the longship, right? And it's just like, these people, they almost synthesize the warrior spirit and the honor culture of the Germanic tribes, with the profound piety of Christianity. And the Normans just went around Europe doing this for fun. In the time of William the Bastard, there were still lingering also true tribes. I shouldn't say also true because that's more modern, but there are still Germanic pagan tribes in northern Normandy, closest to the coasts, involved in the complex interplay between Normandy and England and Denmark, often serving as mercenaries, right? But the Normans just did this for fun. They went across Europe. They took Sicily. They took southern Italy. The very way southern Italy was taken by the Normans was because Norman mercenaries betrayed the Byzantine Greeks, who they were in service. The Lombards, who they were in service from, after kicking the Byzantine Greeks out, and then said, "You know what? Actually, we're just going to keep this land." They're like, "Well, why would you do this? How could you do this to me?" Like,
if I can interrupt, I want to throw it to North to make sure that you haven't spoken on this topic just yet. What's your feeling on this entire the premise that we're talking about here?
I think there's a danger in, and I'm not saying you guys are necessarily doing this, but I think there is a danger in looking back and defining what behavior is exemplary of Christian behavior in history, because I think the standard that's often used as well, this is actually just German behavior, it's not Christian behavior, or this is actually, the Crusades, for instance. The Crusades, I've certainly heard the claim from some pagans that, well, the Crusades is obviously not Christian, it's fundamentally pagan because it's a warrior movement, when really their standard of what Christian is the sort of soft megachurch Christianity of the last 40 years, and that's taken as kind of representative of the correct or the proper understanding of Christianity. To me it strikes me as a more modern lens, I guess, viewing back. And I'm not saying, I think the truth about something like the Crusades is maybe a bit of both, in the sense that there is a Christian nature to it, but there is also this much deeper sort of tribal nature as well. But I think the broader point being, I think we have to be careful when we look back at history and refer to something as like implying that anything involving war or conquest or warrior culture is inherently antithetical to Christianity just because what is popular contemporary Christianity would scowl upon it.
Well, okay,
That's absolutely fair, and I would
Yeah.
agree with you. We're all, as Nimes pointed out in the early part of the stream, we're all colored by our zeitgeist. We're all colored by the rationalist, sort of post-Christian liberal mentality. This very rationalist, hindsight is 20/20 kind of view. So I would agree with that.
Well,
I think that's a
again,
fair thing to say.
we'll push back a little bit. So my actual point, my point here is more or less that what is conceived of, especially as both Catholic and Protestant Christianities, Catholicism and Protestantism are both idealisms that don't really exist in this world. This is a world in which Christianity is effervescent, it's very malleable, and there is virtually no top-down enforcement. Like the ability top-down enforcement ends at Pisa up until really the 12th century. Okay, and then you have the emergence of these things that are called really the emergence of these things that are called textual cults, textual communities, which is when the ability to just copy information documents and spread them far enough to make something like orthodoxy a possibility. There is no possibility of orthodoxy from really almost the crisis of the third century in Rome all the way up to at least the Carolingian Renaissance, and then it collapses again and doesn't start to reemerge until the 12th century. So all of these peoples, and we have so little actual paper representation of what's going on here, and we can't really trust what we've got. You know, they get even the documentation we have, they get eclipses wrong, and there's stuff wrong in their recording that renders us unable to really say anything except these people were left to their own devices. They basically had these gospels. We pointed out these Saxon Gospels. They've got this story. And again, if you read the gospels themselves, they don't have the Pauline corpus. They don't have the Old Testament. They have commentaries, you know, like Alfred is doing commentaries on some of these other books. But they have really just the story of Jesus, and then they're left to their own devices to fit it in however they want, however they can. And so all of these cultures are dangerously syncretic. At all, they're unstable. They're syncretic. They're constantly recombining, and as much Germanic, really the Germanic paganism. Another one of the things that you have to look at is that there is a class element here. There's certainly true. There's a class element here. You know that meme of the airplane with the red dots? It's all shot out. A lot of our surviving records, a lot of our surviving records of Christianity come from very educated people, which means these are people who have read the Greek text and this sort of thing. They've read a lot of the philosophy that's coming out of the Mediterranean world. Peasant Christianity doesn't have any of that. The most startling thing some people can see is like these pagan tendencies are I would argue that they're apparent today in the culture of like people in Southwest Louisiana who have a very different concept of the Courrier de Mardi Gras than even the people in New Orleans do. But if you look at these visceral French representations of these books, the French books of hours, which is these illuminated manuscripts that are produced in the 14th to 16th centuries, they're still this is one of the only documents we really have of what peasant Christianity looked like. And it is remarkably pagan. We still, you see representations of pagan deities in them. And they've just been sort of nominally converted in this way that's not very systematic. It's not very, philosophically bound. It's like, oh, okay, all these gods that we've been talking about, they're subject to this abstract higher power that we call Jesus, but we don't really understand that. What we do understand is the Samhain or whatever that's guarding the gravesite.
Yeah. One thing that I noticed when I was reading Albion Seed, I'm not sure where people land on David Hackett Fisher anymore, but I thought that was a very...
We love David Hackett Fisher.
I like that book, and he breaks down what constitutes a folkway, or there's like 25 something folkways that constitute a people, right?
Yeah.
And it's marriage ways, clothing ways, education ways, and there's two that are placed side by side that I thought were very interesting. One was religion ways. How do you practice religion? Then there's magic ways right beside it. And it's like, what sort of folk beliefs do you have? What superstitions and rituals do you have that these people seemed to experience no discord in having with them? I always joke with my wife, she's a Catholic and whatnot. But one thing we joke about, how can you believe in heaven and also ghosts? Like, how can you believe? It seems that people have this sort of fusion of really believing in Scripture, but also all this other kind of superstitious luck-based stuff. And everyone kind of does this, but they figure it out. So if you actually break down what your day-to-day beliefs are, it seems to be, I don't want to keep using the word synthesis, but it's sort of a mixed bag of these things.
It's the right word, it's the right word in this case, because this is what they're doing. These are, until really the 16th century, until the actual Protestant Reformation happens, these is like, you just imagine a chemistry. Have you ever let yeast grow in something? You have like a bread culture or something like that. This is an unattended yeast. This is an unattended yeast culture. It is just boiling.
Man, you're just gonna get a sourdough discourse happening in the chat.
That's exactly what I'm doing. It's like you get this like emergent Germanic Christianity is like this sourdough mutagenic combination of these like very internalized sort of pagan Christian concepts of personal honor, personal behavior, relationship of the self to the community, that get reified into this Christian context, and they just kind of get rearranged and they get fitted like, yeah, because this is what the power structure that we believe in right now says. But there's no oversight. There's nothing like orthodoxy. There's a great book on this. It's called The Formation. No, it's there's two. One of them is forming formation of a persecuting society is the name. Is the one I'm talking about. It's a very controversial text, but it talks about how there's not really anything like an Orthodox Christianity coming out of Rome until nearly the 12th century. And they do this. They establish orthodoxy by othering several groups of people. One of them is lepers. One of them is Albigensians. One of them is they start building these like in-group narratives that can be replicated and passed consistently. Because you run into this problem. This is really softly introduce the Nick Land stuff. This is a data replication problem. Okay, this is a problem with your ability to standardize information across a swathe of land that you control, but don't really control. Like you nominally control it, so you're like, yeah, we'll take the tax payments from Belgium, but to make sure the tax payments from Belgium don't stop, we're not going to step on them too hard for having 5 wives. You know, if you understand what I'm saying? Like, so like this
is the exact situation with the Franks, like for an entire 400-year period. Christ, you even look at excuse my language, if you even look at if you look at the Frankish invasion of the province of Gaul, before Clovis, even though they were all Christian, the Franks engaged in these horrific fratricidal blood feuds. Clovis absolutely destroyed all of his brothers and cousins who were competing in Austrasia, which is what it was called for geopolitical primacy. And then this is before they pushed out the Visigoths, who were also Christian. But for this 400-year period, concubinage was tolerated among the Frankish kings. This fratricidal blood feuds in very typical paganistic fashion. There's nothing that they could do about it. It took a very long time for a lot of those old folkways, a lot of those old honor-bound conceptions to transform into something else. The transition period is very fascinating for me. You also see things, and perhaps maybe NorthHugr knows about this, but you also see things like depictions of Jesus wielding a spear, and on tombstones, on art. And the viewer is unsure whether this is supposed to be Jesus or Odin, or Woden, I guess, because Woden is also famously one-eyed and carries a spear, and the symbol of Germanic paganism being the Thor's hammer or the Mjolnir is also very vaguely in the shape of a cross. So you see these very interesting convergences culturally, and of course, right. I mentioned the burials before.
So the British are the people that I know the most about. That's my background. My nom de plume is Chris Sandbatch, and I invented it because it's the most English-sounding name I could come up with. And this is to softly introduce the concept of canon formation as well, because one of the early texts that I include in what I would call the English canon is a book called Asser's Life of Alfred. This is a text that was produced about Alfred the Great possibly Alfred was still alive when this book was produced, but it was certainly within the lifetime of somebody who could have known him. This character Asser writes this biography of him. It's fascinating. The first 2 chapters of this biography of him trace on one side his Germanic pagan ancestry, on the other side that traces his biblical ancestry back to Adam. And the joining figure is this figure called Sciaffa. Okay, and who is this figure Sciaffa? Go look for that one somewhere in the annals of the past. But when even these figures that are the only English king that's ever been given this moniker, the Great or whatever, and it's as his legend is being built, as his history is being written, what we do is very consciously literally marry and fuck the classical Greco-Roman Christian tradition to the Germanic pagan one, and come up with this very physical synthesis of it. Like, this is a synthesis of it that is happening consciously, and it's sexual. Like, it's like this pagan father fucked this classical Christian mother, and the baby that came out of it was Alfred. You know.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, the go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say Rousel, actually, on the subject of Alfred the Great. Tom Rousel, also known as Survive the Jive, points out when it comes to Alfred that he, in very typical English fashion, claimed descent from Woden.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles have the genealogy of the kings, and they all trace them back to Woden. They trace it back to a number of, basically they have, here's how we can show that every king, and this was still something that once they became Christian, like Alfred the Great, this was still important to them that they had this descent from Woden. And more than that as well, I mean, you see this with Snorri. Euhemerizes the history of the Norse gods into the broader narrative of Christianity. I think when moderns in the West, when we come at Christianity and we look at the Bible, we look at this as like a separate history to the histories of like the Greeks or the Germans. Whereas, and you also see this as well, like with Saxo Grammaticus in the Gesta Danorum, he also euhemerizes and lays out the history of Denmark. But what's really going on is, for someone like Saxo or for someone like Snorri, they're kind of taking these pieces of the puzzle that you're getting from the Old Testament, that you're getting from their own mythology and deep history and stories, and they're basically saying, we're kind of reconstructing the history of the entire world now. We're pulling these narrative threads together, and we're also pulling in, like, where do the gods play into this? And they're often like euhemerized into great kings, or they're referenced as coming from Troy after the fall of Troy, and coming up into the north. But in that time, there was a much greater understanding of, here's where our nation fits in to this grand, now Christianized narrative of human history. And that's something we don't have as much today. It's like, well, there's the Christian story and there's the pagan story, and like they're like, we're gonna build the whole thing. Like we're gonna understand the super story and where we fit in. It's not like our history just starts once we become Christianized. It's like, we've been around this whole time, and here's how we play into this.
Now, there's a direction I'd like to take this into, and I certainly want to discuss the Nick Land Western canon idea, but I just want to give a bit of background on one of the reasons I was picking this topic. Because why does anyone want to talk about paganism and Christianity again, still?
Right.
As if we haven't done that enough. We've seen every version of that, right? It's not a debate. It's not going to be whether or not Jesus was the first turbo Jew, any of that shit. Not interested in it. But I'm going to mention a couple of books I've mentioned before, just to give some background in what I had said earlier about, I know Sandbatch, you pointed this out, a discussion of modernity, and I'd mentioned the Meta Man, and I was reminded of this book that a listener had mailed to me that I love. It's very hard to find, called Decadence by Jim Haugen, who is a journalist, and he was discussing the counterculture movement in the 1960s. And he was talking about
your listeners mail you books about fucking hippie syncretism in the 1960s.
Yeah. I've got.
You're like, look, chat. Yeah,
I got a rosary sent to me too, and I've gotten several shipments of cheese.
That's fucking awesome.
You will fascinate Dimes by sending him a wheel of cheese.
I'm open to all cheese.
This is the same way. This is also for you single guys. This is the same way you can get a woman. You can give her a piece of cheese.
Give her a wheel of cheese. Women aren't used to seeing a wheel of food. They're gonna think you got some connections. But it was this book. It's kind of hard to find. So I got the hardcover version, and he was describing the feeling. And this would have been written around the '70s, and he was on vacation, some Caribbean island, and
Smoking peyote, but like
this is the thing. Like he's there, and he's among the locals. He's among these island dwellers, and he's like, "I want to live like these people. They're alive. Look at them. They don't give a shit about all the stuff that's geopolitics."
How flared do you think his collars were on his satin suits?
Anytime I go to a place like that, I'm wearing white pants. You best believe.
Yes.
But he started to feel at odds, and maybe a lot of us feel like that we're on vacation, right, in a place like this. They start to feel like, oh, I feel alien to these people because as a Westerner, I'm so used to self-analyzation. I'm always used to stepping outside of myself, of investigating the own context in which I'm living. These people don't live like that. It's like when you read Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin, which we covered on the show before. Like it's a more traditional, historic form of spirituality. They're immersed in the world, and you never allow yourself to be immersed. You're always stepping back from it. And that merged with this other book that I had read that I really like. And Sandy, you might like this one because it had notes of Tavistock all over it. This was Disenchantment of the World by
this is another call. This is actually good L&D fodder, actually.
It was interesting because he was taking the same approach of saying that, what caused this separation of us from spirituality, true spirituality, the immersed spirituality that I would argue that many pagans and Christians don't have. They can only, like I said, apprehend these ideas almost surgically. And this is what what's that fucking Jacques Ellul's talking about? Like our tendency, at least in the West, is to step back and sort of draw a circle around everything so we can dissect it. And we think dissecting it helps us understand it more, and it does. We understand the mechanisms of it, but that destroys the essence of it in the process. And it's our tendency to keep doing that.
So that is the emergence of history, capital H history, by the way. And this is the thing that I talk about quite a bit. Because, I have the land thing, but really the basis, everything with me goes back to this German historian, Reinhard Koschlik, who was, he was he wrote Critique and Crisis. He was like the shitlib Western rationalist narrative that most people are familiar with is the one that comes from Jürgen Habermas. And there's nothing really, it's an interesting theory, but I think Koschlik's is a little bit better. And he's the one that he hypothesizes all this thing, this birth of history, this ability that suddenly emerges in like the 1500s or the 1600s to conceive of history. And history is this thing where those people in the past are different from us. You understand what I'm saying? It's like we're separated from them in some weird way. Okay, that makes us non-continuous with them. And this is different from the Bourbon, like the last Burgundian dukes at the close of the 15th century. They were the Burgundian dukes, and they actually imagined themselves as totally continuous with the Roman Empire. Because of dux, duke is derived from this word that means dux, which means leader. It was an appointed position in the late Roman Empire where you're in charge of this province. You're the dux of this province or something like that. But like in the 14th century, in the 15th century, the Dukes of Burgundy imagined that their thoroughly Germanized, thoroughly feudal like method of going about governing was totally congruous with the ancient Roman Empire. They thought they were the same thing. Suddenly, 16th century, no longer have that. We have this thing called history now, which is like, this is like, those people in the past were different from us, and we are separated from them. We've been sundered from, there's some lack of continuity, and we're adrift, and we're making it up for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think and you're going to hate me for bringing this up, I think it might have been McLuhan. It was either McLuhan or someone else, but it reminds me of the transition.
Total Canadian victory.
It was describing the transition of our understanding of time as something we're immersed in versus time as a container of value.
No, that's right.
Yeah,
this is where he's on solid ground here. These are not the problems I have with Marshall. He's on point right up here. We're in lockstep at this point.
And so one of the reasons, just to continue the through line I had, was that if we're talking about a synthesis, let's keep using that word, of Christianity, paganism, which is sort of the immersion of these cultures, could something like that happen in the 21st century in a different way? And I'll describe what I mean, because if we accept that, for better or worse, it seems that the people we're talking about, they tend to be Westerners. I don't really give a shit what Japanese Christians are up to. I got
Right.
no idea what they're doing over there, but I think, because this is really what we were trying to get at with that whole beginning of the discussion, was explain how Christianity, Catholic Church specifically, but also definitely Protestantism, has a distinct European character, a Europeanness, despite the fact that it came from the East. How the fuck does that happen? How does it? And I think that's what everyone's responding to. A lot of guys in our political milieu, they're attracted to these grand cathedrals, maybe not even due to spiritual reasons, but they're attracted to some kind of distinct Europeanness. And how did that happen? So, point being, just to move on from that, because I think most people will probably agree with that. If there is something like a synthesis that happens going forward, can it be facilitated by the fact that it seems that both sides, pagans and Christians, seem to be employing both these spiritualities for rational or political even reasons? Because I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but how many pagans, like how many Christians, how many people convert to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy just because they want to have a war with gays? How many people convert to paganism because they hate liberalism? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a sizable amount. Not everyone, but some. So if there is a fusion, could it actually be along political and cultural lines rather than spiritual lines?
I'm just going to come out and say that I already think that this synthesis is happening. If you, and I've commented on this before, if you look at, like, there's no difference between leftist Christians and leftist pagans in their worldview. There's absolutely no difference. They both worship this almost Gnostic, secular cult of the supreme being or cult of reason, whose name is equity. If you go to the Reddit Norse paganism and then you look at what many of these Christian NGOs are doing, they have fundamentally the same worldview. They may be using these separate traditions as a skin suit, but if you take away that packaging, you very quickly see that their worldview is almost entirely the same. They're just justifying it through these different traditions. And conversely, it's not a coincidence that all of us are having this discussion right now, and we're all a hodgepodge of right-wing Christians and pagans who agree with 95% of the same things. You know, perhaps maybe there's a doctrinal or an aesthetic difference, or in some cases cultural differences. But you're seeing this convergence for a reason.
And also another example of this, I think, just to give him some credit, or criticism, depending where you're standing. This is the Apolloism project that Richard Spencer and Mark Brahman are engaged in. I'm not a huge fan of it, but you can tell that that's their attempt to basically create a new religion or create a new cult, but it's through a ethno-political understanding of it. Like I would argue, I think they would agree that they don't worship Apollo. I don't even think they have the processes in their mind to actually worship Apollo.
I'm very skeptical of any so-called cult or religious movement that is not actually theistic. Very skeptical.
So North, I've been thrown a lot at us. I gave a whole long rant there. What do you think about that? Does my assessment of maybe the driving forces of some of these movements, does that sound true at all?
I think you bring up a lot of good points in that it's important that this was part of my attempt with the documentary, and it was a small sample size of just, Mr. Rousel, who was the pagan in the film, but we did discuss to an extent what are the primary motivating factors for those who are taking the approach of paganism, and certainly some come at it for purely aesthetic reasons. I think the aesthetic reasons are honestly underplayed. I would my own interest within in these sort of classical pagan stories is partly the narrative, partly the characters, but to a great extent it is the aesthetic draw. And what we've seen in the last, especially the last 100 years or 150 years in particular, is this way in which the West has really divorced itself from its traditional aesthetics, its traditional national aesthetics. There's a reason, like it's a very different experience to go and worship in a contemporary church that is doing basically like a rock band concert versus if you were to go out into rural Norway and worship in a stave church. Like these are drastically different aesthetic and spiritual experiences, even if they're both kind of on paper pursuing the same thing. Um, Beyond that, we talked about this. I talked about this as well with Tom. There is certainly a faction of the more right wing leaning pagans who are their first principle isn't actually their belief in the supernatural or their belief necessarily in the gods themselves. It's primarily as a sort of utilitarian tool for their ethnic interests, for their in-group preference. And that's a very different thing to actually believing in the existence of like the more tangible existence of gods per se.
To touch on that, I
yeah.
agree. I agree with that. No. I was going to say I think you're dead on. I think that a lot of the synthesis you're seeing is the convergence of political theology. I think that right-wing Christians and pagans share basically the same political theology, and for many, whether they're aware of it or not, because of the fact that they're products of their zeitgeist, because of the fact that they're products of a post-Christian sort of rationalist and liberal world, it is an expression of that will. It's an expression of that will.
Yeah, and also just to be clear, when we say this stuff, like I've said before, that the ultimate criticism of the true traditionalists was that, like I think of Evola, I think of René Jounan, like their criticism of us would be, you're not traditionalists because you're still locked within the liberal framework, and so that's something I'm trying to work with rather than saying we must return, we must go back or anything like that. I don't even think that's necessarily possible. I'm trying to figure out a way forward and factor that in and understand what it is that draws people not only to Christianity but also paganism, because I think there's some commonality there.
Well, I guess my take and kind of my thesis within this project that I've been working on is this idea that there's a reason people are drawn to paganism. I think a big part of it is this sort of heroic mythology. A big part of it is this sort of sense of historical rootedness, this connection to aesthetics that resonate with our ancestral instincts, however you would put it. I think people tend to be drawn to certain architectural styles, certain clothing styles, ways of engaging in with the natural and the crafted world. And I think the Christians in the last 150 years in particular, really post the Romantic movement that you saw in like the 1800s, where you did get this revival and there was this attempt to kind of re-tap back into our ancient aesthetics and folkways. The Christians, we have really become historically amnesiac, or we've developed this historical amnesia, as one of my friends would put it, and we become detached from that, and so it's no wonder then that people are looking for something that resonates with them, that has the aesthetic factor, that has the historical factor to it, that has this sort of grand narrative where they fit into it and they have that sort of ancestral connection to this grander story. Like there's a reason that there is this appeal, and I think Christians would be wise to pay closer attention and see, maybe we should start taking seriously this project of looking back into our own history, understanding how Christianity fits into these. Oh, I got disconnected there. Am I back?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Everyone can hear you. Okay, perfect. Yeah, sir. I muted myself and I was saying, oh, I can see you. Good. Yeah, you'd only cut out for a second there.
Okay. Yeah, I think my point was broadly brought across. It's like, we have this version of Christianity that's much more akin to like an airport or like global kind of aesthetic or culturalist expression. And really, like what Christianity has done at its most successful is it baptizes cultures into itself. It is sort of like salting food. Like we're to be salt and light unto the earth. Well, what does salt do? It brings out the inherent flavor within existing food. What does the light do? It reveals the actual nature and depth and color within what it shines upon. And what does baptism do? It cleans. It gets to like it wipes away the muck and the falsehood and the dirt on people, on a culture, on a nation, and it brings out the cleanest or the purest form of it. So really, that's ideally the Christian vision that I would put forward is we should really be bringing out the best in what we had in our past, rather than just kind of moving past it into this decontextualized Christianity that's not connected at all culturally to any tradition or any aesthetic or any folk way.
I think that's a very good summary of it. I just wanted to call attention to this. I had a super chat here. Really love your stuff, guys. I'm going to assume he's talking about all of you, but I'm keeping the money.
Well, that's the best part of super chat. That's the best super chat ever. It's like it doesn't require any input. It's like, thanks, man.
Thank you.
That's just a good dude doing good dude things.
So I also wanted to speak to that as well, NorthHugr, because I think you're spot on with that. And one thing that I've noticed from many of the tradcasts, and I guess perhaps many of the Christians in general who are finding their way back to the faith, or perhaps if they had never found, they were never part of the faith, they're recently converting. They almost seem to approach Christianity in a more puritanical attitude than, say, even their great grandparents.
Yeah.
And what I mean by this is, like, a week ago, I found a photo or a series of photos from 1907 of Anglo-Canadian Protestants dancing around the maypole. And
you love it. Love seeing
our own
that. Love
exactly
seeing it.
like our own great grandparents were Westhailing at Christmastide, handing out hot orange drinks to their neighbors. Charles Dickens' depiction of Father Christmas, the spirit of Christmas, is effectively an amalgamation of Woden and Jupiter and Saturn. And like, this is a Victorian era tradition. The English were rediscovering their Germanic roots. And that was just part of the spirit of the times. But you see so many of these Christians who are trying to excise this. They're trying to excise these, almost of which they view as tumors. And it's like, no, man, like, yes, maybe it is hypocritical in some capacity, although you made a great case that it was not. You made a great case that the true spirit of Christianity was this kind of accommodating, amalgamating, synthesizing force. And yeah, it's just fascinating to see, like, a great many are very they're almost more puritanical than their own great grandparents.
Well, I think to your point, and you brought up G. Ronald Murphy of the Society of Jesuits, and am I getting that right? SJ, that means correct. But I think he makes a really strong case in Tree of Salvation, if my lens will pick it up, which is all about kind of tracing Yggdrasil and the symbolism and the mythological importance of Yggdrasil and how it's integrated into a Christianized Northern Europe. I think he makes a really strong case that we had, and to your point, Fortissax, he makes a really strong case that in the early centuries of Christianization into Northern Europe, this integration was done in a way that was healthy. It was it seems like somewhere along the way, like, and I can get into the examples. He has a lot of examples in architecture and art and archaeology to back this up. But somewhere along the way, and maybe it's because it didn't seem to be as necessary hundreds of years down the line, but this sort of faded out of the churches, or faded out of Northern Europe, the ways in which, it was understood how the cross and how Christ plays into the same narrative, that the narratives within Norse mythology, they're essentially leading up and find their completion within Christianity. That's the reason why Christianity is good news. It's good news because Ragnarok's coming, and you want to survive Ragnarok.
First, I need to call attention to Paladin one more time. He was a good dude doing a good thing, but here he went and started having an opinion. This might be dangerous territory.
No. I saw that one, and I was waiting on that. Bring that one up. Weren't the original Christian? weren't the original conversions of pagans done for political
Yes,
culture?
in some
Problem-
senses it was.
The problem with that is that there's no concept of either culture or politics at that point. That is the presentism. That is the modernity presentism, where you've taken what was an original force vector and you've split it along its x and y axis, and you've decided politics and culture. There's a matrix that I can positionalize this motivation in. No, it's way more flowy than that. These people are in the fucking flow state. Okay, they're like, yeah.
Also,
God makes
also
sense
in the case of
that
Rome, this is what Charles Cochran, the argument that he makes, and there's other authors that make this too. But if you think back to Rome and the spread of Christianity in Rome, there's a comment here in the chat about how it was related to the destruction of the Yao men, and that all that is part and parcel with it as well. But there's a thesis in the book, and I think this is backed up by history, that shows when you're a Roman citizen and so much, and this is kind of like the fascist model, and so much of your identity is bound up in the state. You derive your entire identity from the state, and that.
No. I have to interrupt here. This is not an identity. This is not an identity. An identity is a very contemporary thing. Like when we use that word, this is their world.
Yeah, let me say it is more immersed. But as I was saying, like once the state begins,
this is their worldview. Res publica means the public thing. Okay. This is like the state is their religion. Okay, like this is the basis of everything they believe. Okay.
Well, that's what I meant. But then once the state, which is this organism in a sense, begins to falter, begins to get corrupt, if it can no longer provide materially, you're actually left standing there and say, well, what the fuck am I? And you maybe asked that for the first time in your entire existence. And then there's this other thing called Christianity, which is an entirely different entity. You've never, and it's difficult to explain the mind revolution that was to a Roman citizen who had never encountered this thing that's higher than this. It's outside of everything. It just seems bigger. It's grander. It's the introduction of it's a revolutionary concept that was not just dropped there. It took centuries of development, and there was many ebbs and flows and false starts and attempts to suppress it, and all, the entire history. But I think that part of the spread, and you could say it was facilitated by political changes. Yes. However, what made it work wasn't Machiavellian. I think that's one argument, that they converted the aristocracy, right, and then they made the rules that everyone had to convert. Yeah. It's like people don't like to
for cynical reasons.
Yeah.
Now, I will give some examples in my view of more sort of material and or cultural purposes for why this would happen, and I will no doubt get some pushback on this. But if I recall correctly, and to Sandbatch's point, even though this is very hindsight is 2020 perspective, we're limited by our zeitgeist, living in a rationalist world. If I recall correctly, you look at the example of Constantine. Constantine was somebody who was baptized on his deathbed. Nobody actually knows if he was really Christian or not. He murdered his wife and then his mother. Did he do it for political and strategic political purposes, for consolidating power, for trying to bring stability to the empire? I think there's a plausible case to be made there. If you look at the English Danelaw, the Vikings viewed in some cases Christendom and Christianity and conversion as a method of access into broader civilization, because they associated Christianity with civilization. They associated it with Rome, and not just a sort of sedentary a nomadic warrior kind of life. And this tendency also traces back to the earlier Germanic tribes with Rome. Their relationship with the Roman Empire was very much, okay, there are material benefits to becoming civilized, to becoming sedentary, to having permanent settlements, to, and in order to access this, we have to become Romanized. So we circle back to the Normans, which is like, was Rollo actually Christianized? Or, we know he was. Did he do it in order to consolidate control over Neustria? Probably. Like there's reasons, that was one of the conditions. If you stop raiding us, we will give you this land, and you must baptize yourself. But there's nothing in Rollo's behavior that demonstrates that he took this as perhaps as seriously as he should have. So to answer the question, in my view, did some people or some figures do this out of a sort of cynical material purposes? Yes, I think so. I think there's a case to be made.
I don't think there's anything cynical here at all. So this is the thing, is like, we want to do this, is like, is there a political consideration? Yes, there's a political consideration, but there's no division in these people's minds yet. There's no division in these people's minds between politics and providence. Okay? And so, like, they understand in a very real way, the baseline understanding of Christianity is fundamentally pagan, which is their God conquered our God. Okay. And so, and additionally, we can extend that. This God, the negotiating with this God, this total holistic concept, this people, this God, negotiating with them on this ground gains us this material advantage, but there's no separation between the temporal and the spiritual advantage. Okay. So these two things are fused. This isn't cynical. It made perfect sense on all planes at all times. Yes, there's a decision that has to be made. There's this character that looks at and this is the essence of medieval kingship right here, is that this is this person on which his negotiation with the ether, which is a concept we haven't really talked about. His negotiation with the ether versus the material and the spiritual is what determines our fate. Okay. And so, like, yeah, you could say, I don't want to say this is cynical, this is political, this is anything like this. On the basis of what this man knew, he did these things because his concept of the gods told him to do that. His concept of the gods, extends, back to his concept of the gods extends to, his own people's subjugation by this Jesus character who, by the way, joining up with this Jesus character and acknowledging him as the overarching deity has done my people very well. So why not keep
Well, this was Clovis's perspective too. Like his wife, was a Christian. He was still hailing whatever Frankish gods, the old Saxon Frisian gods or whatever, and he had never lost a battle. And then very famously, he loses a battle and prays to Christ to grant him victory. And lo and behold, he wins this battle. And then he's like, all right, we're all converting to Christianity.
Yeah, and I think the wrong way to look at that, as you and Sandbatch are probably saying, is cynical. That's looking at it with a 20th century, 21st century modern view. It's like, oh, that's self-serving. But they wouldn't have viewed it like that.
Sandbatch rule number one. Never assume your sources are cynical. Cynical is a 19th century
and that's why I was talking about, like, these.
You know.
If you go to beyond pagan, back to Paleolithic tribes. Go, like we mentioned before, Saxon Culture by J.D. Unwin. It explores how these tribes engage with everything. Like, everything was immersive. I think even McLuhan talks about this, but it's hard to describe to a thoroughly modern person what that's like, because we're highly segmented, extended, auto-amputated, psychologically self-analytical people. We actually don't know what it's like to live like that, for religion and spirituality to be immediate.
The birth of tragedy. It's the birth of tragedy, the birth of the lunar, the birth of irony. Yeah. These are not ironic people. They don't do things for they don't do things for. I mean, they do things for hidden motives, but even their hidden motives are more honest than our hidden motives are. It's a very sticky thing. It's a very difficult thing to try and, like, the K lines don't exist, to bring up another one of my favorite.
And I know we actually have to get going soonish, and I know this next part we can probably gush about for 45 minutes, but I wanted to tie this into, again, the through line that we've been discussing this entire time. I'm going to throw something up on the screen. This is a compact article written by Nick Land. I do not pay for a compact, so I don't have access to the whole thing right now, but I did cover this on one of our paywall shows. It's something that we brought up time and time again in our communities. Nick Land, very well known, I'd say philosopher. He might call himself something else, but he was playing with this idea and Sandbatch, I know you go very, very deep into this. I think you even spoke to him once about this in DMs. The idea, and I'm going to explain this, and you tell me where I'm wrong, but this is how I've been using it. So there's this thing called the Western canon of all the important literature that really dominates. I don't want to use the word identity, but the
You're already wrong.
yeah,
You're already wrong.
okay, let me get to the end. The Western, this is how I would explain to people, like, there's certain works, there's certain ideas that are fundamental to our entire being. Shakespeare would be one.
No, that you're right about it. You're
Shakespeare
right about
would
that.
be one. And the idea was, once something is elected into the canon, and you can't really control what it is, you don't vote on it. It's not really done through popularity. Only the centuries really bear this out. But once something is elected into the canon, it cannot be removed. It's there forever. And there's a discussion about trauma to be had here if you wanted to, but we're not going to do that right now.
It's exactly what it is. So here we are in the late stages of this stream. You broached the most complicated subject so far.
Here's what's interesting. If you look at the Bible, obviously, would be in there. However, so is Darwin. So is Richard Dawkins.
But the Bible is it just here's the okay, like I have to interrupt you right here because this is where you start
because that was going to be the main thing. It's going to be the Bible and Dawkins
talking...
side by side, and neither can really be removed.
Right. Okay. But this only works. We're not talking about the Western canon. Whenever we talk about this, we're talking about the English canon.
That's true.
Okay. Those are different things. Okay. The Western canon is an additive, universalizing, abstract concept. Okay. So the Western canon really is a concept that's not very old. It's about a century and a half old. And it's probably best represented through this like Harvard Great Books. You know, Dr. Eliot's 5-foot shelf. These are all the things you need to be a citizen. Whatever. But when you think about what is the West? The West is an abstract concept. And we've spent the last hour and a half poking holes in this idea that there could be the West because we make an argument about France or Gaul that doesn't hold at the same time or even in the preceding 2 centuries or the next 2 centuries about England, or we have to go make this other point about Germany or this other point. What the things that hold these cultures together, we have to abstract them to the Bible. When we build something like the English canon, though, we're looking specifically at the 1611 King James edition of the Bible. We're looking specifically like so when you build a concept like the Western canon is different in the sense that it has a different goal. Its goal is to unite Westerners. What are the things that unite Western peoples? And that's, you have to overcome abstraction after abstraction after abstraction to get to that. You have to overcome the difference between France and Italy and Germany and England. But when you start with England, you have this different thing. Oh, we're going to build the English canon. Where do we start? Paradise Lost, not the Bible. The Bible, and also Asser's Life of Alfred comes in before the Bible. We have the 1611 Bible. We have these 2 things, probably the only 3 texts that we could use if we were going to seed an English canon. The texts that we use are Paradise Lost, the King James Bible, and Asser's Life of Alfred, or maybe the Ecclesiastical Histories of the English People. These are already indefinitely different assumptions than those on which the Western canon is based. Because whenever we build an English canon, what we're trying to look for is the minimum viable data set that can be used to reconstruct the English worldview. We take this very compact, like zip filed thing, and we can rebuild all of England from it, theoretically. You know?
And also, just a note to the side, later in the article, he does mention that I believe Beowulf would be up there as well. So you have this really fascinating.
Yeah.
He
doesn't really know. He kind of poops on Beowulf, and so do I. Paradise Lost is the central one here. Paradise Lost is the central one.
Okay, so radical idea.
Yeah.
Radical idea here. Maybe a little crazy. Could there be a case to be made that globalism with the Anglosphere exporting its culture have led to a more unified canon from the emergence of the Anglo world and its cultural and socio-political pressure on the rest of Western civilization, could there be a case to be made that all of these sort of converged? Because
And
I would
this is
say
how we
when you
get to the
talk
Bank of
about
England, Sandy.
when you
Yes, exactly. You're not wrong.
when you talk about when you talk about Western canon, what I think of is the Bible and the Iliad.
Yeah,
But then
but
Dimes,
okay,
made a really good point, which is like, yeah, Dawkins is inevitably, whether we like it or not, is
but
part of Western
here's the
canon.
thing about the Iliad. Okay, so if we're building a concept like the Western canon, then the Iliad goes in first. The Iliad, it's written in Greek, written in Homeric Greek in the 7th century. Fascinatingly, if we're building a concept like the English canon, we can't include the Iliad until after Paradise Lost. The Iliad is first translated into English after Paradise Lost is produced. So the English-speaking world's immediate introduction to these to these classical concepts, these Homeric concepts, actually is through Paradise Lost. It's not through the Iliad itself; it's through Paradise Lost. So, so the Iliad comes after Paradise Lost in the English canon. The English canon starts with Paradise Lost.
What about perhaps a multi-layered model? What do you think about that?
I mean, these are certainly multi-layered models. What we're really talking about is how these concepts, the Western canon and the English canon, interact with one another. And what we really end up seeing is that this English canon, if you're talking about, and I do this from a specifically English perspective, the Western canon is adversarial, actually. It's attempting to steal things away from that which makes you English and incorporate them into that which makes you Western. Okay, does that make sense? So the English canon has this and the English canon is an interesting one versus the French canon or versus the German canon or versus the Polish canon.
Sure.
Because it includes this text, Paradise Lost, which is so mesmerizing. Where the land articles, there's 3 articles. There's Why We Need the Canon Wars, The Open Spiral, and then The Devil's Work. Because the most important concept, the most important text in the English language is Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost is based on this idea of this dazzling anti-hero revolting against God himself. Okay, and land eventually has to come around to this idea that, this is really the basis of Protestantism. And a lot of us remember when I said Protestantism is revolt against orthodoxy. Okay, so he comes up with this idea that what Protestantism is this preordained revolution against that which is ordained. If providence is all encompassing and rebellion exists, if Satan in Paradise Lost's rebellion against providence exists, then rebellion against providence itself is ordained by providence. Okay, this is the self-licking ice cream cone of Protestantism that eventually results in my argument that the most Protestant thing we can do right now is be Catholic, because and he does this incredible thing where he brings this basis back to because the English there are people who eschew cousin marriage, and he calls it the open spiral. They're naturally open to outside ideas, and so then he says, if we're going to have this canon of that which is English, if you were this is kind of what the dark forest theory of the canon, which is okay, if you're in the dark forest of the world and you're the English and you have this, so the canon has the canon does this one thing, which is it's this series of encoded information that allows you to replicate your culture in toto in case of sort of catastrophic collapse or demise or something like that. But there's also this countervailing force where it says if you say too much about yourself, you're just empowering your enemies. And you could argue that we've done this by shifting our focus towards the Western canon in the 20th century. What we've done is we've abstracted our own concepts to the point where we've told everyone exactly what our weak points are. We have this tendency as Northwestern European peoples who eschew cousin marriage to be very open to outside concepts. You can game us for that. You can game us for that with Section 8 housing. You can game us for that with anti-colonial guilt. You can
I was just about to say, yeah, that's an interesting connection you point out there.
So when you're building a canon, you want to do two things. You have to, first of all, you have to encode the information that is essential to you, but you also have to put gaps in the information that makes it so that it's difficult for you not presenting a large attack face for your, for your adversary. Because when you declare this is in our canon, when you say Paradise Lost is the basis of our canon, you're telling your enemies, if you study this text, you can find our weak points. Okay, so you have to simultaneously minimize what is in your canon, and then you have to also optimize its ability to universalize to your specific people, which makes it sort of adversarial with the Western canon in the sense that universalizing for the Western people necessarily involves taking away what is universalizing for the English people.
Mm-hmm. I think you might have summed up. I think you might have summed up the interesting difference between the Anglosphere and continental Europe.
Yes,
although I do still retain my belief that these are under the umbrella of Western civilization.
I see to call attention to one super chat here. Another one from Paladin. He worked overtime at the Cabaret last night. He has got a bunch of these 20s. Now, I think I know who this is, Fortissax. This might be our French contact under a different name.
Dimes. Oh, you know what? Oh, okay. I thought that French contact.
yeah, the French contact. Yeah, the guy the only guy I know who works at a cabaret.
Oh wait, hold on. Winkler's meat here. The Fonzie, says, but Sandy, did English intellectuals know Greek before Paradise Lost? They did, but Paradise Lost happens at this very strange juncture in history. Whenever we can set the printing press has been invented, and suddenly this educated class of English people, and this is the difference between Milton and Shakespeare, actually, is that Milton was born of this educated class. This is the first time, Milton's Paradise Lost is the first time the fact that these Greek-speaking English people, these Greek-speaking intellectuals could speak directly to the people and give them a text that they could understand. So there have been cloistered English monks and that sort of thing that knew Greek before this, but Milton is in the first generation that has access to be like, go directly to the people and say, the Bible is here in English and I'm explaining it in English. There's no Greek interpolation that needs to happen. So that's the important thing that's happening there.
So just a couple other comments here. Also, Paladin says the complete works of Monty Python are part of the English canon as well.
We have a 100-year moratorium, so like.
Sex Freakman says, Sandy, my EMJ sense is tingling. I think it means Michael Jones.
No. He's the only person I have ever actually hung up on in the middle of an interview. We do not get along. It's like,
well, he's interesting because we interviewed him on the show. It was only for around an hour, but we'd also covered his book, Logos Rising. And he was an example of what I was talking about sort of getting both arms around this idea of Christianity from a philosophical point of view and describing the word, sort of the evolution of the word of God and it having, what was it? He said that humanity needed the Greeks to basically teach it how to understand God. That was one of his central arguments. So, which is an interesting way of looking at it, but it's very grounded in linear time. And so, our evolution of thinking is so that we can understand these larger ideas. And so, anyway, the point being that the reason I was bringing up the English canon, and we can really get into the weeds on this. I know we got to get going soon. And I apologize. I'm trying to bring this back to the main topic because I don't want to box out North from this conversation. But the idea being that if we accept this, that there's something like the English canon or the Western canon that seems to have these incongruent central pillars involved in it. Like I said, there's let's just say there's Beowulf. Let's say the 1611 Bible is in there, and let's say Richard Dawkins is even in there because he says that in the first article as well. We don't seem to have any trouble balancing those, or rather, it might not need to be something we can reconcile. And to circle back to the earlier point we were making, any sort of synthesis between paganism and Christianity not only has happened historically, but it could happen in the future, although not along spiritual lines. It'll be this other thing, and I guess that would be, and we can maybe even end on this. I know I've said that a couple of times, but I was reading this book recently that we haven't even covered on the show. We're going to be covering in the next episode. It is called Building a Ruin by Yakov Fagan, and it's describing the Cold War economy of the Soviet Union, and a lot of communists and Stalinists will say that the communist system failed simply because it wasn't given a shot. But if you actually look at the internal politics in the Soviet Union at the time, it's much more interesting. There's a similar left-right dichotomy that you see everywhere else, because I see it more just a function of a civilization rather than an ideology. But you got the reform side and you've got the conservative side, and they're trying to figure out how to adapt their economy. And over the course of from Brezhnev up to Gorbachev, you see this not adoption of the American system, but the acknowledgement that, okay, we need to catch up and defeat America, to compete with them, we need to engage in this scientific technological revolution. We need to distance ourselves just from commodity and industry. And that was a very difficult transition they did. Point being that it was that process of getting away from just commodities industrialization to innovating technology and also developing a consumer market for the stuff that, and also the transition from the American or the Western system, not to be purely capitalist, but also sort of a fusion of capitalist, socialist, technocracy, that they both sort of converged along these lines. Long story short, it seemed that technology and the drive to technology was disrupting both of these pure systems that people thought they were servicing, but just couldn't if they wanted to survive. So what I was going to say was, if we are talking about a synthesis of Christian and paganism, not along spiritual lines, could it possibly be along technological lines? Or is spirituality having to catch up and fit itself in with a technological revolution that is now the singular driving force of seemingly every civilization right now? That's a lot, I understand. Does any of that make any sense, by the way?
No,
Yes.
it makes total sense, but it makes me cross-eyed because we're wrapping up, and it's like that's where I start talking a lot.
So, firstly, it's a weird coincidence you bring this up, because I was actually just recently reading about Soviet history, and the reforms by Khrushchev are very fascinating, and then you get to Brezhnev, and it's like this guy ruins everything. Like, if you get that example of that newsreel meme where it's like local man ruins everything, and that's basically what Brezhnev did to the Soviet Union. He backtracked a lot of these reforms that were attempting to reconcile the Soviet Union's internal problems with Reformation, and just very, very fascinating stuff. I think you're 100% correct on that final point as well. I do believe that traditional spirituality and religion are undoubtedly catching up. I think that technology as a driving force has certainly made much of it obsolete, and and it's not just in spiritual religion, but it's also in terms of human organization. And of course, we can, Sandbatch is right. Like, we could talk about this for another 2 hours. Like, Burnham and Harris in Managerial Revolution and in Leviathan and Its Enemies talk about the technology's influence on the managerial system, and how the managerial system came to dominate everywhere, starting in the USSR and then in the Third Reich, and then also ultimately in the United States and Canada, and encompassing the entire Western world. So yeah, man, that's a lot to chew on.
All right, so Sandy, first of all, North, were you tracking any of that? I understand. I'm trying to relate it to the central point. I know I was going to cap it off at an hour and a half, and before I kick this over to Sandy, because I know he's probably got a lot to say on this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm gonna get Grok to give me the simple baby version of that. But I'm trying to. I guess there.
Basically, it'd be synthesis between paganism and Christianity. Would they be following step with technology? Is it, you see what I'm saying there?
To be honest, I'm not in this. I mean, you can see in the sense, like, I've had this conversation with my Icelandic friend, which is that he goes to the example of the reason why, and again, perhaps I'm taking this in the wrong direction, so stop me if I am, but you can see that I think a lot of the ways that you can attribute the change in the values of Christianity, or like the popular strains of Christianity, towards something that's heavily emphasizing egalitarianism, heavily emphasizing the sort of global would you say, a global monoculture version of Christianity, something that's much more in line with promoting ideas of, let's say, sexual inclusivity versus a more traditional understanding of Christianity that's more biblically based. This is, to me, it's pretty obvious that this isn't an evolution. This isn't like the natural evolution of Christianity as it exists in the world. Which, like, if technology had remained at the level of technology in 1000 AD, like, you wouldn't get the same evolution, nor would you have modern strains of paganism that are also in this sort of hyper-liberal strain. These are definitely outgrowths of living in an age that's dominated by, the managerial establishment, that's dominated by the ability to defer consequence of these types of low, what would you say, like low impulse actions, or you can't behave. There's a certain degree of sexual debauchery that you suffer more harsh and immediate consequences for 1,000 years ago than you do with modern antibiotics and healthcare. And like, am I taking this at all in the direction that you were thinking, or am I just going totally off in the wrong way?
No, you're doing great. I think that's an important way to summarize it. And I know, Sandy, did you have any thoughts on it as well? And I'm gonna try and see if we can you probably can't keep this under 2 hours. I'm hoping
because you're projecting this into the future, as I understand.
Yeah.
So, but I guess unless you have is your thought that there will just continue to be increasing levels of managerialism into the world, or there will be an entirely different technological paradigm? I guess.
No,
Yeah.
I mean,
let me say, just to answer that question quickly. Yeah. One thing that I was talking about in reference to that book I was talking about, which is that it seemed that the economic systems, as one example, have always been struggling to keep up with technological development. Every single our culture struggles to keep up with technological development, and I would see spirituality doing the same thing. And I wonder if its success can be in rejecting that, or trying to keep up with it and, I don't know, immerse itself in that in some way.
I mean, wouldn't you say it's the opposite, though, in some ways? Like, the managerial state has expanded, and the issue that, like, Musk is facing today is that productivity from technology is being outpaced by the rise in government spending and the rise in the growth of this managerial apparatus. And likewise, it's like because you're saying, like, Christianity or religion is, like, trailing behind. Is that your thesis?
Kind of, yeah. One interesting example just relating to Musk is, I think Musk understands something that no one wants to say out loud, which is that people need to work, people need labor for their identity, but the economy may very well not need labor. We're struggling to actually find jobs for people, and that conflicts with the paradigm of mass migration. We don't really need unskilled labor if we were to really invest all of our capital in the automation at hand, but we kind of keep this system of bullshit jobs and fake stuff going because we don't know what to do otherwise. We haven't caught up with the possibility, and we're kind of seeing that with AI. Not really, but we're gonna get there.
No, it's there. It's there.
Yeah, and
I'm curious about Sandbatch's take.
Yeah, no. I mean, we're totally there because you don't really even need the material existence of the thing, but you only need the certainty of the material existence of the thing. It's totally disrupting the entire structure that with this thing, the concept, this modernity thing that we've come. We are suddenly in a world. It's BB Knives talks about this. Roland Gunn talks about this. Like Ashley talks about this. This hyperabundance scenario where all of a sudden, like, this, like, necessary to produce and survive is no longer a compelling narrative. It's been a compelling narrative for Christianity. It's been a compelling narrative, particularly for Protestant Christianity, for the last 400 years. That seems to be dissipating now. Okay, so, like, there's this massive free-for-all. Okay, so, like, this economic incentive, this idea that we need to optimize religion for the material circumstances of production, so we can outproduce our enemies, that seems to be going away. So the justification for religion, the justification for what religious belief is, seems to be changing. We're sort of freeing people from the material constraints that were imposed on them at the very start of the stream. Okay, so like now all of a sudden we have this, okay, so what do people decide to believe and for what reasons now? It's kind of this weird all hands on deck approach. Personally,
we shouldn't be treating religion in the sense of how does it assist in mass and scale, or how does it rival mass and scale?
But it has been for the last 400 years. Both Protestants and Catholics have done this, and this is probably why there's an extant sort of pagan revolt against it. What I would sort of see happening is that I don't think Christianity is any danger of surviving, but I think Christianity, as it's conceived by lots of Christian sects who have been ideologically, politically persuaded to, sort of buy into one particular aspect of Christianity. I think brittleness in your Christianity is going to be a detriment moving into the future, because the material advantages of sort of ideological comportment to one specific brand of Christianity, or one specific brand of paganism, I think these are probably decreasing. We're entering an incredibly synesthetic era right now, where like nobody really knows the rules, nobody really knows what's going to. But I think the idea that Christianity is going to go away or that paganism either are going to go away, are probably pretty dumb. What we're sort of like looking at this world where we're going to see how they interact with one another moving forward, and we don't really know how it's going to happen.
Yeah, and let me give one example of what I'm talking about. And this is something we discussed when we were talking about information theory, and you get into quantum mechanics. I think even I'm going to give some credit to a guy that a lot of people don't like, but I remember Curtis Yarvin. He had this interesting statement about like the movie Inception, how showing that film to someone in like the 1920s or 1930s would blow their fucking mind, because the idea
it blows my mind even today. I can't watch that movie.
Just the plot of like, okay, but you're at like
it's MK Ultra, by the way. Tune into LND Monday night 7:30 Memphis time.
Yeah. But the idea was that like your mom or your sister or your coworkers can actually understand that, because it's like, okay, well, you go to sleep and there's different levels to your psychology that you can go on through, and each one is affected by time. You get stacked different times within, and then you get lost in the temporality of your own mind. Like, that's a really trippy concept that everyone can fucking understand. So point being that that our capability to conceptualize these things on a base level has advanced with our understanding and our embracing of technology and some scientific ideas. So the point being that, it could be said that at some point in the past, people might have imagined God as a man in the sky if they had to. But when you talk about information theory and drill down the quantum level, there's this really interesting thing that emerges where you're trying to, and this is kind of what even Schopenhauer's getting to, the concept of the animating will. The idea that they're saying, well, everything is codes down to like the quark and the Planck. Like, things are codes, but what do you mean by a code?
Encoded.
A code tells
encoded may be more important than code.
Yeah, it's like a piece of code that tells the particle to do a thing. It's like, well, what is that code? Like, so because of our scientific understanding, God may have transitioned from a man in the sky down to the animating force of the molecular and submolecular level of things. And that's how you can get someone like your mom, your sister, your coworker to understand this idea, which is a very heady, abstract idea, that you inhabit the mind of God. And you had no way to have a 360-degree understanding or conceptualization of that before now. So our collective understanding of these like scientific and really trippy principles has allowed us, has forced our spirituality to adapt to that. And maybe that means we're separated from it. And that was what Marcel Gauchet was saying in The Disenchantment of the World. It's like, the more we try and rationalize spirituality, the more distant we get from it. The more we...
It's a left hemisphere. It's a process of moving religion into the left hemisphere. And I think the way you're describing it, it's like very abstraction based. It's very word based. It's very left hemispheric, and I think there's a danger in pushing like so much of the modern. I mean, if you read, there's a great book, The Master and His Emissary, which goes into great detail about structural differences between the left and the right hemisphere and how they communicate. And I'll put out a video. Uber Boyo has a great video on this as well. But I think as we're moving into an age that's defined by technology, that's defined by these abstract categories, by language, it's like we're stepping away from the ability to actually apprehend the transcendent. Yeah, by Dr. Ian McGill, Chris.
I've got this book on the list. I'm going to be reading this in like a couple weeks, I think. But I've had a lot of people recommend this.
Well, warning, it's like 800 pages or 600 pages. It's ridiculously long. I listened to the audio version, so...
and also, if you're a fucking psycho like me and you're coming at this after reading Julian Jaynes and the breakdown of the bicameral mind, you're probably going to be...
Julian Jaynes, by the way, is the ghost that's been hovering over this entire conversation that we've all been kind enough not to mention.
By the way, everyone, so just to let everyone know, all the listeners, reading books does not bring you happiness.
Yeah, no, it does exactly just the other thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess to kind of cap my point in a way that makes more sense, moving from the more quote-unquote primitive understanding of God that our ancestors would have had 1,000 years ago, or even 500 years ago, to the more hyper-rational understanding or like theory cell understanding of God that we have today, if we're like looking into quantum mechanics or we're trying to understand a more, what would you say, almost like mechanistic understanding, or the language is escaping me, but the version that we have today that's removed from experience, that's removed from intuition and aesthetics, it's like I would caution considering that to be a more sophisticated or a more helpful understanding. I think this book is worth tapping into for that.
Just to give, I don't know if you've ever read or heard of Julian Jaynes. I'm probably going to do another very sketchy paraphrasing of it, but it's called "The Breakdown of the Bicameral Minds" is the title of the book, the one I'm referring to anyway.
Yeah, I'm super curious about this.
Yeah, I think I haven't read this, but it sounds like it could be similar, where there's a part, in short, there's a part of our brain that, and the exact part I don't have it on top of my head, ironically, but we don't use it anymore. It's just this like dead appendage that we don't use anymore. And the argument was that at some point in the past we did use it. And
the pineal gland.
It's somewhere near the back, I think. No, but it's actually, but we've done experiments and we can trigger it, scientifically. And we notice that when we do trigger it and manipulate it, people can hear voices. And there's this idea, the theory posited in the book was that when this part of the brain was active, however many centuries and generations ago, this allowed a more immersive relationship with the paranormal world, because there actually was no difference between hearing voices and your conscience. You didn't know what your conscience was. You just heard voices.
Right. Yeah,
you were completely immersed in your own psychology. And so people...
The idea that the voice of God is actually like from within.
Or even voices of the dead. And then they started noticing that these burial sites, a lot of the corpses had their tongues ripped out or something like that, because people were actually convinced that the dead were speaking. They would hear the voices of their ancestors.
Have you read Roman... So outside of Rome, there's what's called the Via Appia. And if you read, the rich people were buried along the Via Appia, and so you can still see the grave inscriptions of wealthy Romans, and they're taunting the living. It's like, they'll say things like, "Come in and sit on this bench next to my grave, and I'll tell you of the futility of life and the struggles of love." And then they'll have this cute little thing. It'll be this Clarissa explains it all tier subtweet about the nature of life and everything is, if you consider this James theory that like anybody who stopped to sit on that bench actually heard those voices saying that, you understand a lot. Like it changes the way you think about the ancient world in a fundamental way. It's like, okay, this is not metaphor. These people really heard these voices, you know.
And then there's a lamentation of the gods no longer speaking to the people in the Amarna letters.
Yes.
And also, I recall he made the point of ancient statues with enlarged mouths because perhaps people could hear that. So there was just this total immersion between their consciousness and their memories of their ancestors, and like to the point where oftentimes they were tortured by them. They wanted them to shut the fuck up.
Well, and also point out that women have not actually encountered the bifurcation yet. Women have not bifurcated their minds yet, and they still like hear statues speak. This is a true statement.
Sorry, I think who's about to talk there because that's we could spend 2 hours on that.
And perhaps this may be a correct. I mean, this may be correct about human history and about our minds or about our brains. Like, but in some ways, it is also like a very modern way to look at spiritualities, like or look at the spiritual dimensions, like, and the supernatural. It's like, how can we use neuroscience to explain this in like a totally scientific materialist mode? And I think that doesn't mean it's necessarily false, and like maybe it is this proper understanding of it, but it does. I mean, I don't think the ancients would have thought of it in those terms.
Absolutely. Okay, so guys, I think that's probably a good place. And we covered it. Believe it or not, we covered everything I wanted to for this.
Wow.
I had a phenomenal time. I wanted to make sure I get everyone's shout outs here again. So NorthHugr, we showed some clips from the documentary. Phenomenally well done. I want everyone to go out and watch that right now. You can find it on his YouTube there. It's also on his X page.
Well, thank you. Well, and just as a kind of final comment, I'm very average intelligence, so I try to, unlike the rest of the gentlemen in this call, so I just kind of hang out and try to fit in. So I try to explore
you gotta
these
understand,
concepts.
we're just insane. Like we're not even smart.
Right?
I'm insane and retarded.
We're crazy, is what we are.
Listen, brother, I'll tell you what. I'm with you on that as well. Like, I had to stop watching that German show on Netflix, Dark, because it completely broke my brain. And the same deal with Inception. That whenever you're dealing with time dilation, I've got to back out. I'm out.
Yeah. So I'm trying to, I guess, with projects like these documentaries, and we'll see how viable it is to do more like this in the future. I'd certainly love to, but I'm trying to, in some ways, explore these ideas aesthetically and visually because I'm not a highly articulate writer who can always express things in the best way. So I think the process of trying to do it visually and experientially through a documentary, through these sorts of interactions, and hopefully through that conversation, through that dialectic, it's not like a final statement on these issues. It's not meant to be definitive that this is the documentary covering these subjects. But it's just kind of opening a door, and then hopefully it sparks ideas in the minds of people like Dimes and Mr. Sandbatch and Fortissax, so that they can go and have the even more like relevant or important conversations.
Yeah, you don't do yourself enough credit. You are a smart, intelligent person, and you produce something that is not easy to do. You actually went to the place, and so,
I could vouch for that. I could vouch for the pain.
Right, I was looking at this. I was looking at the scenes that y'all were showing from that, and like I'm so linguistically bound. Like I'm such a language bound person. It's like one of my biggest one of my biggest weaknesses. I'm a great writer, but like I do things like write screenplays and then throw them away because I have no fucking idea how to make a movie. So like you all actually like you can like do things like what's showing right here. This looks like to me like the work of the gods to me. It's like you take words and turn them into pictures, which is incredibly more expansive. It's way more important than anything I do.
Well, I think the beautiful thing about documentaries is that I'm pulling from things that already exist. So like in a narrative, in a screenplay or something, if you're turning a a fictional story into something on screen, you have to like still create that whole world, and you have to account for whether the acting is good or bad. Whereas with something like a documentary, it's like, well, I know the acting is going to be good because it's real people doing real things.
Right.
And the locations, like if you see this church here, it's like, well, I don't have to create a set; it's just there.
This
like,
is
I
beautiful.
can just tap
by the
into
way.
the real world.
This is everything about this is beautiful. This is
thank you.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Well, I can't take too much credit for it because this is like just the inherent beauty of the world that like God has created and that people have gone out and
the best compliment I can give is I look at something like this and I go, fuck.
Look at that blue. Like, yeah, look at that blue. I've never thought about that blue before. Yeah.
I know enough about, like, I'm not a filmmaker, but I know enough about it to know how hard this was to do and how expensive it was.
Yeah. And I guess that's the question is, are there ways we can scale our projects like this in the future and find a way to do it more sustainable? I think that would be pretty exciting. But sorry, I'm kind of getting off topic. I don't mean to.
No, because I wanted to just, like I said at the top, the fact that this doesn't have 500,000 views or a million views, and it should, and it likely will, if I have anything to say about it. But like this is the type of thing I believe we need more of. And it's not, you're not an insane person like us. So you could actually say things in a way that regular people with jobs and girlfriends like, instead of just
not scaring the hose.
I'm so good scaring the hose and making all the incel Maoists in my audience very, very happy. Moving on, I know we got going. I wanted to say once again, check out. Let me get the captions up here. Also, Fortissax's Substack, amazing work there. Very, very similar to this. You're gonna love it. Check it out. You need to be checking out Christopher Sandbatch's Eco-Americana.
No, take all of my shilling and go there. Like I am transfixed. I am like skewered on the color in this right now. But like, like I'm okay. So I've been slack on the Substack the last couple of weeks. I have written between 50 and 60 poems as an attempt to sidestep writing the novel that I promised everybody I would finish. So, like, the novel's 70% done. There's a poetry collection that's coming. And then I would really... You all need to go... I have been co-hosting Library of Mass Destruction with Capitalismo and in the Tookies Mag group. Y'all need to go follow Cap and check us out on Monday nights because we're having a great time. And this is the first time since 2017... I've had a project that I'm like consistently working on with somebody else. Like, you know, Capitalism was like training me to like re-enter society or something like that. But
yeah, you were doing Aberration in the Heartland of the Real, I think, by Wendy Payne.
It's an incredible book. Have you read it?
Yeah.
That book is incredible. Like, that was wild. But yeah,
once I read that, I'm like, oh, I get it now. I get the Pat Con argument. Like, I get this. The entire three-dimensional view of what happened here, and it's not good.
And then there's all because, you know, as the strange person I am, I have shitloads of personal connections with MK Ultra, and we talk about all of them, and like all of my little the guy who's one of the head honchos with the Old Glory Club told me yesterday. He was like, LMD was great. It continues to be a study in Sandy with a book reading on the side. You know, so I mean, I have a great time with it, but y'all should check it out. And you should also check out Capitalismo because he's the most underfollowed. Capitalismo, Tom Will, and Mike of Pole, I think, are the most underfollowed persons in the right-wing e-sphere. Y'all should go check them all out. They do incredible work.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think I got everyone there. Yeah, I'm a good friend of Capitalismo as well. I was on Drive Time movie night with him the other day. He's producing a lot of good stuff. Okay, I think we got every chat here. Thank you so much for the super chats, everyone. Thank you for the hilarious and insightful comments. And I love this thing. I love this stream, man. This was just like fucking catnip for me. So thank you everyone for participating, and I'll see you all next time.